Hi everyone, my name is Alice Rowling. I'm a recent Juris Doctor graduate from the Melbourne Law School working in the Melbourne Law School Tax Clinic, or the MLS Tax Clinic for short. The MLS Tax Clinic is a supportive, inclusive, student-run clinic where you can receive free tax assistance from Melbourne Law School students either online or on campus at the Melbourne Law School. We are a part of the National Tax Clinic program, a government-funded initiative to help people who may not be able to afford professional advice and representation with their tax affairs. Our students are supervised by a dedicated clinic supervisor and experienced tax practitioners. To apply for assistance, please see the application form on the MLS Tax Clinic website. Today, I will give you a brief outline of the different kinds of guidance issued by the ATO and how binding they are for individuals for tax purposes in Australia on behalf of the MLS Tax Clinic. These distinctions are important because it dictates what your obligations are if you follow the guidance and whether or not you will be protected if it turns out to be inaccurate. In this presentation, I will discuss legally binding advice, administratively binding advice, mere guidance, some examples from each of the three categories of guidance, and provide further resources. Binding advice means that if the advice turns out to be incorrect, you won't have to pay any extra tax that arises because the Commissioner of Taxation has to honour what is said in these rulings. You also won't have to pay interest or be subject to penalties for making false or misleading statements. There are three types of binding advice that the ATO releases: public rulings, private rulings, and oral rulings. Public rulings are how the ATO expresses their interpretation of the laws they administer. There are lots of different types, including taxation rulings and taxation determinations. Private rulings set out how a tax law applies to a person in a specific circumstance. You can apply for one to be certain how a tax law applies to your particular circumstances if tax ruling and determinations don't have the information you need. Oral rulings are advice given over the phone to taxpayers who are individuals. They are the ATO's opinion on how a law applies to you in your specific circumstances. It is ultimately up to the taxpayer if they want to follow a ruling or not. They are not law, and only the Commissioner of Taxation is bound by ATO rulings. You would obviously follow a ruling if it was favourable to you, but if a ruling is not favourable to you, so you don't want to follow it, you would need a good reason not to. For example, you have a compelling reason why the ruling would not apply to you. The ATO can still impose penalties on the taxpayer for not following a ruling, but they might exercise discretion not to if they are convinced that the taxpayer's case is sufficiently different to the case that the ruling was determined upon. For example, Anna wants to know when she can deduct her transport expenses as an employee, so she reads TR 2021-1 to know how the ATO would apply the law to her. Anna wants to know how the tax law would apply to her in a specific circumstance. She wants to know if she could deduct the cost of her law degree from her taxes because she works in a law firm, so she could apply for a private ruling. To get a private ruling, Anna would fill out the form on the ATO's website that includes the necessary information about her situation and the questions that she has that she needs clarification from the ATO on about how the law would apply to her situation. An example of an oral ruling might be if Anna phoned the ATO to ask if she was exempt from paying the Medicare levy. They might provide her with some advice and a registration identifier to indicate that they provided her with an oral ruling that she can rely on. Administratively binding advice is applied for like a private ruling and given to help taxpayers in situations when the law doesn't allow the ATO to provide binding advice. This means they will stand by their advice unless there is a legislative change after the advice is given, a court or tribunal decision affects how the ATO interpreted the law in the advice, or it is no longer appropriate advice. If advice is administratively binding, it means that if you follow it and later find out it doesn't correctly apply the law to you, and the points above don't apply, you won't have to pay any extra tax that arises. You also won't have to pay interest or be subject to penalties for making false or misleading statements. For example, Ben wants to know tax consequences to his company if it makes a takeover bid on another company without that company's consent. He wants to apply for a private ruling from the ATO, but this is an area of the law that they cannot provide advice on. The ATO still really wants to help Ben understand the tax consequences for his company, so they provide him with some advice that they will honour unless the law changes after they give him the advice. However, after the ATO gives Ben their advice, the government makes legislative changes in this area, which means the ATO no longer stands by what they told him. Consequently, he is no longer protected from having to repay amounts of tax payable or any penalties and interest on those amounts. Had the government not made these changes, he would have been protected from repaying those amounts and any penalties and interest on them. Lots of information published by the ATO is merely guidance, which means if the advice turns out to be incorrect, you will have to pay any extra tax that arises. However, you still won't have to pay interest on that extra tax or be subject to penalties for making false or misleading statements. Practical compliance guidelines provide broad administration guidance by setting out what tax laws mean practically and how the ATO recommends approaching compliance. Law administration practice statements provide ATO staff with direction on how to approach the laws that the ATO administers. They are not meant to provide advice on interpretation to the general public, but do sometimes discuss some technical issues. ATO interpretative decisions are an edited and released version of how the ATO approached making a decision. They indicate how the ATO might go about applying a law and help to make sure the laws are applied consistently and accurately, but they are not meant to provide advice to you. Draft rulings are published so that the ATO can consult with the public to develop the ruling. In their draft stage, they are still informal. Oral guidance might be given over the phone or in person if a matter is simple and straightforward. The ATO website provides lots of information to help you understand the Australian tax system and your obligations. This information is generalised, though, and does not take into account your specific circumstances. Decision impact statements are released by the ATO to address significant decisions made by courts or tribunals and what the ATO believes the effects of these decisions are. Media releases are announcements that the ATO make about their intentions and positions on issues at the time of publication. Tools and calculators are available on the ATO website to help you work out the answer to a question, like whether or not you were an Australian resident. For example, Anna wants to know more about deductions that she can make for working from home, so she Googles it and reads the ATO website. The information she read here would be guidance. Anna has also heard that there are new tax offsets that have been announced, so she reads an announcement from the ATO about it. This was a media release, so it would be guidance. Anna is also wondering how much tax she will end up paying from her income this financial year, so she searches Google for an income tax calculator. She finds and uses the Simple Tax Calculator on the ATO website. What this calculator tells her would be guidance, so she cannot rely on this as legal advice. If she has further questions and concerns, she should seek advice from a tax or legal professional to help her better understand her obligations. To sum up, there are 3 broad categories for advice issued by the ATO that vary in how binding they are. The most binding kind of advice issued by the ATO is binding advice. They also issue administratively binding advice and advice that is merely guiding in nature and thus not binding on them. If you are still unsure and would like further assistance understanding whether the information you have read or received is binding on the ATO, you can book an appointment with the MLS Tax Clinic, learn more about the different types of guidance and how binding they are on the ATO's website, or consult a qualified accountant or legal specialist to help you assess what category the information you have read falls into.